If you tried to start a family with a completely different species of animal today, even a chimpanzee, which shares 98% of your DNA, it wouldn't just be impossible. It would be biologically absurd. The cellular machinery simply wouldn't allow it. Yet, 45,000 years ago, your ancestors did exactly that with another species, the Neanderthals. And they didn't do it as a strange, accidental anomaly. If your ancestry lies outside of sub-Saharan Africa, about 2% of your genetic code, the instructions that build your immune system, determine your skin type, and shape your brain's chemistry, doesn't belong to Homo sapiens. It belongs to another human species that walked the earth long before we took it over. For generations, we have been taught a very specific, very dark story about our origins. We've been told that early humans were tribal, violent, and deeply hostile to anything different. We've been told that when Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa into Europe, we encountered a species of dim-witted, brutish cavemen and waged a brutal, prehistoric war of conquest against them, hunting our evolutionary cousins to absolute extinction. It's a clean, dramatic narrative of survival of the smartest. But the chemistry in your own blood proves that this story is wrong. The dawn of human history wasn't defined by a brutal, prehistoric blitzkrieg, but by a 20,000-year peace. So what actually happened when these two species met? And if we didn't wage a war to destroy them, why are we the only ones left? To understand why we got this story so wrong, we must go back to 1856, when the first Neanderthal fossil was discovered in Germany's Neander Valley. The Victorian scientists who analyzed these bones lived in an era dominated by ideas of social Darwinism and colonial empire. To them, history was a ladder of progress, with modern Europeans at the top. When they looked at these heavy bones, massive brow ridges, and thick limbs, they didn't see an equal, they saw a brute. Early scientific illustrations depicted Neanderthals as slavering, hunched monsters incapable of language or art. For the next century, this was the textbook definition, because they were completely gone and we were here. The conclusion seemed entirely obvious. We must have killed them. We were the smarter, more refined species, and we cleaned the slate. But over the last few decades, archaeology has quietly demolished every single part of this Victorian fantasy. On average, a Neanderthal's brain was actually slightly larger than yours. They weren't hunched, they walked as upright as we do. Their compact, heavily muscled bodies were built to conserve heat and survive the brutal winters of Ice Age Europe. They didn't just hunt with rocks, they made highly sophisticated tools. They harvested birch bark and cooked it at precise temperatures to create a synthetic adhesive, a prehistoric superglue, to bind stone points to wooden shafts. They controlled fire, built shelters, and wore clothing. They hunted massive, highly dangerous Ice Age megafauna at close range using heavy thrusting spears, leaving behind skeletons with healed fractures almost identical to modern professional rodeo riders. They were tough, resilient, and knew how to survive in a punishing landscape. But more than that, they had humanity. When Neanderthals got sick or injured, their groups didn't abandon them. We have found Neanderthal skeletons of elderly individuals who had been blind, missing limbs, or crippled with severe arthritis for years before they died. They couldn't hunt, yet they lived for decades, because their close tribes kept them alive, fed them, and cared for them. When they died, they buried their dead with care. These were not wild beasts, they were humans. And when Homo sapiens walked out of Africa 45,000 years ago, they didn't find monsters. They found their equals. If you want to understand what the meeting of these two ancient worlds actually looked like, you have to look at the Levant, the region of the modern-day Middle East. This was the great geographic crossroads of the ancient world. Around 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens made their first tentative steps out of Africa, while Neanderthals were pushed south by expanding European glaciers. They met in the caves of Mount Carmel in modern-day Israel. If the War of Extinction theory were true, this is where we would find the battlefields. We would expect to see sapiens weapons embedded in Neanderthal bones, or signs of violent, scorched earth competition. But we find the exact opposite. For nearly 20,000 years, both species lived in the exact same region, often using the very same caves. They hunted the same deer and wild gazelles, collected the same plants, and, most surprisingly, they even used the exact same stone tool technology. Archaeologists call it the Mousterian tool industry. If you looked at a stone scraper made by a sapiens and one made by a Neanderthal from this era, you couldn't tell them apart. They weren't out competing each other, they were living parallel lives, sharing ideas, and adapting to the same environment. And then, they took it a step further. Archaeologists have found tiny, perforated seashell beads coated in red ochre pigment in both sapiens and Neanderthal archaeological sites. These weren't tools tools. They were jewelry and fashion. These were two entirely different species of humans, sharing the same aesthetic trends. To share a fashion trend, you can't just be throwing spears at each other from a distance. You have to sit down, observe, and communicate. But the most undeniable evidence of their peace is written in our DNA. When geneticists successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome, they confirmed that sapiens and Neanderthals had children together. But to understand this discovery, you must understand the sheer biological barrier they crossed. They had been evolutionarily separated for over 500,000 years. In evolutionary biology, when two populations are separated for that long, they begin to lose genetic compatibility. Recent studies suggest that male hybrid children were likely sterile or had significantly reduced fertility. The genetic machinery was barely compatible, meaning that producing a viable, healthy lineage of mixed species children was incredibly difficult. It wasn't the result of a few isolated, violent encounters. For Neanderthal DNA to persist for 40,000 years, it required consistent, long-term interbreeding over thousands of years. It required communities to accept these hybrid babies. Think about that. An early human tribe, highly territorial and struggling to survive, looks at a baby born with a slightly wider chest, a heavier brow, and different facial features. If they were driven purely by xenophobic violence, they would have abandoned that child. Instead, they lovingly raised them. They fed them, taught them how to make tools, and integrated them into the tribe, allowing them to pass their mixed DNA down through the generations. Our ancestors didn't look at Neanderthals as alien monsters to be destroyed. They looked at them and saw people. They saw partners, allies, and family. If there was no great war, and we lived in a state of peaceful cohabitation, it brings us back to the ultimate question: why are they gone? Why did Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago, leaving us completely alone? The answer is slower, quieter, and far more tragic than a war, a combination of climate instability, social structure, and simple demographics. Around 45,000 years ago, Europe's climate experienced rapid, extreme temperature swings, which completely disrupted the migration patterns of key animals both species depended on. Neanderthals lived in small, highly isolated family groups. They were deeply local, knowing only their specific valley, their local mountain, and their immediate family. Because of this, their populations were thin and genetic diversity was incredibly low. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, built massive, sprawling social networks, trading materials, sharing resources, and finding mates over hundreds of miles. When the climate plunged into chaos, Neanderthal groups became increasingly isolated. If a harsh winter or disease wiped out a local family, there was simply no one nearby to help them recover. At the same time, waves of Homo sapiens constantly flowed out of Africa. We didn't ever have to hunt them to destroy them, we simply out-reproduced them. As our populations grew, we peacefully absorbed them, and the smaller Neanderthal group got genetically diluted and folded into the larger, growing family. The Neanderthals didn't end with a bang. They didn't die in a desperate bloody stand on some prehistoric battlefield, fighting off waves of ruthless Homo sapiens invaders. Instead, they faded out slowly, sitting around the same fires we sat around, sharing the same food, and looking into the eyes of our ancestors. They didn't go extinct because we were better at killing. They disappeared because we were better at connecting. The next time you feel a cold winter chill, or your immune system successfully fights off a seasonal flu, take a second to think about where those traits came from. They are the legacy of an ancient 20,000-year peace. Every time you look in the mirror, you aren't just looking at the descendants of the conquerors, you are looking at the survivors of a merger. The Neanderthals never truly left us. They just became us.